Uh, Welcome to this presentation. It's a Consultant's Guide to AppV. So my name is Rory Monahan. I've been working with AppV for about 8 years now. I originally started working with SoftGrid 4.0 and I've gradually worked my way up through all the versions to the current release of 5SP2. I got my start just doing general sequencing. Spent most of my career so far doing sequencing. It's kind of a transition from just doing any old app to always getting stuck with the miserable, crappy apps. So I don't get too much done these days. So the talking points for my presentation today. I'm going to go through some case studies of projects that I have worked on. I've actually worked on about 9 AppV projects altogether. I'm not going to cover all of them, so don't worry about that. I'll just cover about 4. I'm going to highlight the successes and failures. Also what I've learned from success, but mainly from the failures. I'm also going to show you guys just briefly a sequencing decision matrix that I came up with, and it's freely available on my site. You guys might find it useful for planning out customer engagements yourselves. I'll cover a little bit about sequencing talk and tips, not necessarily Microsoft best practices, but what I do myself and just my own best practices. Basically, Microsoft are not always right. I'm going to talk a little bit about AppV in VDI, and also, I know it's kind of already been covered by Dennis, but I'll do a little bit of an overview of AppV versus the competition. Okay, so case study 1. I worked for a very large investment bank. Actually, at the time, they were one of the largest in the world. They had about 48,000 seats, thousands of applications. Now, when they got us to look at application virtualization for them, it was back in 2007. We were using SoftGrid 4.0 at the time. They went into it. They had a pretty smart architecture team. They had researched the product and they knew exactly what they wanted to get out of it. They had very locked down environments, both in their Citrix environment running 2003 terminal services. They followed the best practices from Microsoft for a locked down environment. They also had the same on XP. So basically, the only user writable locations on either OS's XP or 2003 was the user app data location, the user profile, and also the all users app data location. Now back in 2007, the majority of applications were still pretty poorly programmed. So there was an awful lot of applications that would try to write during runtime to the install folder, which would throw up all sorts of errors for users. So they saw the benefit of using SoftGrid to help them get through some of that. If it needed to write during the runtime, it could write within the virtual file system. They also were looking at the benefit of SoftGrid from an isolation perspective. They had a lot of issues where there was conflicts on their Citrix servers because their approach towards their Citrix environment was keeping in mind for load and demand. So they weren't necessarily thinking, okay, this application, what servers does it fit best on in terms of the other applications on there? So it could cause conflicts, and in some situations it did. So with the isolation, they could get around that. They could support multiple versions of the same application on the same servers, and generally just kind of get them out of that hole a little bit. So because they went into it with those expectations, they had very certain criteria for why they wanted to use it. We were able to meet that demand. Of course, it was very challenging at the time because there wasn't a very wide user base of SoftGrid 4.0. There wasn't the wealth of information online to help us. It was trial and error. They were very reluctant to allow us to give up on any application without at least having a reason why it couldn't be sequenced. We hit a pretty high success rate. Now, they weren't sequencing every application in their environment, just ones that they thought were good candidates, which helped. And also because they had that expectations, and their perception in the end was, okay, it did do what we wanted to do. It's got us out of a few holes. They started to expand it to user desktops when they got to the Windows 7 migration too. So they stuck with it, they were happy with it, they learned from the limitations, and in the end, it was a success. Case study 2, it was large distillers making some of the more popular alcoholic beverages on the market. This one was a little different. They were undergoing a Windows XP to Windows Vista migration. They seem to think, which a lot of people seem to think, is that AppV is the solution to all application compatibility issues, which is simply not true. They also seem to think that they could get 80% of their applications virtualized, which, well, it's a sliding scale depending on your application set. Nobody can definitively tell you you can get 80% of your apps sequenced, but seemingly somebody told them. We were also using AppDNA on this project. It was the first project that I actually got to use AppDNA on. And because of that, although they had those expectations which were incorrect, because we were using AppDNA up front and we just piled all their applications in through AppDNA and got reportings at a very high level as well as low level, we could reset those expectations. Now I know I saw during the Geek Speak at Synergy, which a lot of you guys were probably at, I know there was like some coughs about AppDNA not being very good, and it's somewhat true. The reporting isn't 100% there, but I found it pretty useful for just getting an overview and being able to reset those expectations. And because we reset those expectations, even though this company in particular, they were very heavy on the marketing side from a productive user's perspective. So a lot of their applications had drivers. They were graphic-based, and in the end, we were willing to split out the drivers, and we tried in some instances. Sometimes it was a success, and sometimes it was a failure. But at the time with 4.6, even splitting out the drivers meant managing 2 separate packages for the one application, which they were not happy with. They didn't want any extra overhead. But thanks to AppDNA, we got to reset the expectations early. It wasn't a case of just not delivering on the 80% at the end and then saying, like, what the hell? We thought you were going to get 80%, why didn't you tell us ahead of time? Well, we got to tell them ahead of time. We ended up getting their applications done in a timely manner. We didn't get the 80%, but we got somewhat close to it. And because of that, it was a success. Now, not all of them are successes. Case study 2, another bank. This one was actually part of a Windows 7 migration. They also decided to use their Windows 7 migration to really re-up their technology in a lot of different areas. They were rolling out AppSense, they were going to AppV, they were going from 32-bit to 64-bit OSs across the board. And actually, out of interest, if I told you guys, I'm sure some of you have worked on migrations before, but if I had said to you, if a company is moving from 32-bit to 64-bit, what group in that company do you think would shout the loudest to get the 64-bit?
To shout, to get there?
Yeah, to get the 64-bit first.
Management.
Mm-hmm.
No?
Somebody who requires a lot of memory.
Yep.
Maybe the graphics in marketing, I mean.
Well, in this instance, it was actually their software developers.
Okay.
Now, software developers software, if you've ever had to package it and deal with it, it's up there with there's a point of sale type of software where it's just like some of the worst software for packaging, deploying, just managing in general. It's a nightmare. So they were the pilot users for Windows 7. They were going to be the first ones to get our AppV applications. They ended up getting their applications, and first thing they say is, where the hell are the files? It's not installed. I can launch it, but it's not installed. It's like, oh, well, that's AppV. That's one of the benefits. I said, but I want to modify this config file, and I want to get in here and change a registry. And when I compile, it writes a log file to the install directory. I was like, well, we can certainly accommodate that. I mean, just tell us what you want to have outside of the virtual environment, and we can accommodate it. Well, that threw up huge red flags all over the place. And they're like, oh, we can't provide that level of detail. We're just going to give you the install instructions and test instructions that we've always had, which was very vague, to say the least. All those instructions weren't even really equipped for doing a migration for testing, because you should really test your software when you get the US pretty well. But it certainly didn't help with AppV, because we couldn't accommodate for all the different ways they use the software, because they didn't provide us upfront documentation. And if anyone packages here, you'll know, and you've probably said it before yourselves, you can be an expert in MSI packaging and AppV and deployment, but you can't be an expert in every single application that's on the market. So you need that information. You're really only as good as the documentation when you're going to package these things. Unfortunately, from that experience, the company actually decided to scrap AppV right after the first pilot. They went back to traditional means of deploying, which probably in the end, I only worked on the project for less than a year, but in the end, when they were going virtualized down the road, it's probably hurt them more than it's helped. I'm sure they're probably going back to AppV now. But it was a failure. Ultimately, it was a final case study. And I picked this one just because the last three had like thousands upon thousands of end users. This one, we only had like 1,500 end users. So it's a different scale. It was also part of a Windows 7 migration. They also were actually rolling out multiple new technologies as part of it. It was a good time to invest. But they also seemed to think that they could get 80% of the applications virtualized. They also thought that it was going to help with application compatibility. And actually, the funny part of this, from my personal perspective, this was my first job when I moved to the United States. So I arrive and I'm the AppV guy. And then I meet the technical lead at the time. And we're sitting down talking about AppV, and he's like, oh, it's really going to help us with application compatibility. I'm like, I just got here, I'm going to lose my job. A big thorn in the side for that project also was the fact they didn't have a rationalized list of applications. And it was such a small team that it was really tribal knowledge. They didn't have very much documented. And one person that was a lead had all the knowledge of the applications and how to rationalize it. And also somehow didn't have the time, so we didn't have the resources to do that. Something else that was very unique about this company was they didn't QA their application packages, and they didn't really have any formal UAT. Stuff rolled to the production machines. It wasn't uncommon for the developers to make a change to one of the in-house applications and say, yeah, deploy it tonight. And it would get deployed, it would break, and then the person who deployed it would get in trouble. It was a strange dichotomy there.
That was their QA process?
Yeah.
End user QA.
Kind of similar to Microsoft. I left after about a year. I sequenced over 300 applications. They didn't have any documentation. They didn't have any install instructions. They didn't have any test instructions. So basically what I was doing, I was going into a deployment tool they used was Entail. I'm not sure if anyone's used it. Where it's basically like a scripting framework, and you do scripted deployments. So I had to reverse engineer a lot of those scripts to figure out how they're currently being installed, and then sequence and hope for the best, and do some testing. Now, when they started rolling out to end users, I would sit down with them, ask them to test their applications. So those ones I know worked. Now, I sequenced over 300, and the Windows 7 deployment wasn't going incredibly fast. So a lot of those applications were never tested before I left. So what was the result of this one? I don't know. it was a success while I was there, but who knows if it was a success after I left. They didn't have any real testing in place. It was a real failure in procedure, and also not planning for enough resources for such a project. So what did I really learn? Well, I learned process is very important. You got to have QA, you got to have UAT, not just when you're doing AppV, but that's just across the board for any packaging. You got to make sure you got it right. It's better to find those things out before you go to production. Documentation, you're really only as good as the documentation, because again, you can't be an expert in every application that's out there. If possible, you should like to detect all dependencies of applications that are out there. You want to do that because you want to ensure that all the applications that are dependent on one another can be virtualized. If they can, put into connection groups. If one cannot, then maybe you could look at using Run Virtual to have that local and still launch into the virtual bubble of the other applications. But it's good to know all that up front so you can plan accordingly for that. I've listed AppDNA, ChangeBase, and Flexera ACP, ACP being Application Compatibility Pack. I've used all of those as part of migrations and also for moving to AppV. The reporting, honestly, from an AppV perspective, it's probably overkill now, because Microsoft have done a pretty good job of putting in their own little diagnostics into the sequencer. So when you sequence now, the report will show up if there's something like DCOM in the application, COM plus, drivers. So I would go with the sequencer rather than paying a lot of money for something which may not report 100% accurate. Now the sequencer also, it's accurate for the most part, but maybe it's not completely accurate. I've noticed for certain applications where there was COM plus, it didn't seem to pick up on that. I only picked up on it when I ran a process monitor and saw that it was hitting the COM3 reg hive. You can't really mark Microsoft too hard for that one though, because it is, the way COM plus works, it's kind of dynamic during runtime as well, so it would be difficult to pick up on that just within the package contents. Finally on this slide, to sequence or not to sequence, that kind of brings me on to my decision matrix. This isn't the full decision matrix. I don't really want to go through all of it here. I just want to show it to you guys as an example, and you can go out to my website, just get it off the site, download the image. Basically what this is, okay, you got your reporting from the sequencer, but what do you do now? It doesn't give you a whole wealth of information about what the issue is and how to go on from there. So I've basically done this up as a decision tree based on what's in the application. And I also include some stuff that the sequencer doesn't highlight to you. Things like machine-specific licensing. That's obviously going to be an issue when you're sequencing if the license gets applied to that machine, because, well, you can't sequence a license on the VM machine and then deploy it and expect it to work on another machine. Something else like boot time services, well, you'll probably know that before you even go sequencing if it's boot time services. If it's something like, say, antivirus, which is kind of a bad example, you can sequence it. I've played with boot time service applications and just had them launch on startup, but it's not a very nice experience, and I wouldn't advise it. If you can switch them to a manual service instead and just have the application call it as needed, I would go ahead and sequence, otherwise maybe deliver it without AppV. COM plus, if anyone's got a lot of experience with AppV, maybe you could confirm it for me, but from what I've seen, applications with COM plus just don't work. I've seen it suggested on some blog posts from some people that are involved with ChangeBase that it might work and tested, but I have never seen an application with COM plus work. Has anyone? No, I didn't think so. Whereas DCOM, I have seen it work. In fact, the Microsoft's own example of a DCOM application, if you download that and sequence it, sequence the client part and have the server part set up, It actually works vice versa. It can communicate back and forth. So there's more success with decom. It's more of a highlight. Hey, it may or may not work. I'm not really sure what the difference is in the decom when it does work versus when it doesn't work. But it's just something to note. Test it out rigorously. If it shows up with decom, might be okay. Obviously, drivers. Drivers can be stripped out of some applications. Now, what I would say is, if your application has a separate MSI or something like that, or a separate installer for the drivers, it's okay to deploy that, and you can even leverage the deployment configuration XML file to do that. So when the application is added to the client, it will just install the driver. You can even set it to uninstall if there's a clean uninstall too. Personally, if it doesn't have an installer by itself, I would not go extracting the drivers. I would not attempt to go packaging the drivers again myself and just try to figure out, finger in the air, and how it's meant to work. Personally, I've seen when I've messed with drivers, blue screens. It's not good. A little bit of sequencing talk and tips. I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but Microsoft released Hotfix 4 last week. I got a couple of days playing with it, not a huge amount. Jeez, you can't see that with the shit. Yeah, I got a couple of days worth of playing with it, not anything huge, but if you could see that, that's an extra field under the Advanced tab of the sequencer, which allows you to allow the application to write to the virtual file system. So that was one of the big issues with AppV5 to this point. And I know Dan Goff had a pretty handy script that most people who were using AppV5 were probably using, which would let you set the permissions on the folders and allow the application to work. Well, you don't need to do that anymore, and it's much better having this. I know Dan actually tweeted out that he would advise anyone to update their template to just have that checked by default rather than using the script. Hotfix 4, actually, from what I saw or heard from Nick Callan, who was at the Amsterdam user group, he was telling me that the number one issue reported from people in the room was running applications from a network share with AppV5. You needed to basically set domain computers, or at least the computers that you wanted, to have access, to actually have access to the share in order to run the application from a share. It's just the way that, I guess, the client was processing the application and needed your computer object to have access to the share, which was a huge problem for a lot of companies because it's a huge security flaw. Nobody wants that in their environment. Well, Hotfix 4 fixes that. You don't need to have domain computers with share access anymore. One of the biggest problems also with AppV5 was the performance. Publishing was very, very slow. Well, that has also been addressed in Hotfix 4. I actually saw a tweet recently during the week. Somebody was saying that on machine startup, like from a pristine, non-persistent desktop, publishing time was reduced from about 4 minutes to about 40 seconds with like loads of applications. I've tried it out myself, and yeah, it's zippy. It's closer to AppV4 6 performance than AppV5 has been to this point. My own practices in terms of my sequencing environment, I always pick the primary target OS, and by primary target OS, I mean if your customer or your end users, the majority of them are using, say, Windows 7 64-bit. Personally, I like to sequence on that target OS, so I'm hitting the highest success rate against my end users. Now, if I find that I tested on an older operating system during the QA or through UAT and it doesn't work, I can go then and try and sequence on the older OS. And I know there's some of the newer installers being released from vendors do have some conditioned components in them where if it's, say for example, XP it's running on, it installs these files. If it's Windows 7, it installs these files. So it is something to be aware of, but I think if you follow what I'm doing, you'll probably have a higher success rate. And for the most part, it's not really a problem in most applications. You ideally want to have your VMs non-domain joined to cut down on all the fluff that you might capture in a sequence that's generated when on the domain. Now, that's not realistic for every sequencing environment. A lot of, if you're working on a customer's domain, then it might demand that the machines be domain joined and managed. In that case, all's not lost. What I would suggest is running a few just trial sequences, just blank sequences, and see what gets picked up. If you see something that's reoccurring over and over and getting captured in the package, just add it to the exclusion. It's not perfect because you kind of got to keep on top of things. Things might change when it's domain joined, so you just got to keep adding to the exclusion list. For the most part, it's not a huge issue because we've got isolation. As long as it's not something finicky that screws up a certain application, you should be okay. I would advise having a snapshot with Office. Even if you're going for vanilla, at least have a snapshot with Office. Particularly, or mainly if you're having Office on your local build, or on your local image possibly. By having it on a snapshot, it will enable you to set up the run virtual. Also, I would suggest having launched all of the Office products before taking your snapshot, because if you do launch one of the products during a sequence of an add-in or something like that, it might capture your user-specific stuff. Likewise for Internet Explorer, I've seen that happen too. Something that my colleague Mitch actually pointed out to me, and I guess there was a blog post by Tim Mangan. There used to be an issue with 4.6 where there would be a problem with duplicate GUIDs. And if you say, basically, if you had launched this, in 4.6, it was if you had launched the sequencer and then took a snapshot, it would keep using the same GUID identifier for the application, which could then conflict on the end users' devices. Something similar here is happening at boot with that v5. So the suggestion is to save the snapshots in a shutdown state. Don't do like a login screen or whatever, just keep it safe and do it at the shutdown. Now something else I did notice when I was looking at hotfix 4, if you do have issues with duplicate GUIDs, Microsoft added in a new save as new package option, which should refresh the GUIDs.
Nice.
These are just some basic bullet points, but you always want to try and reduce the package size as much as possible, if you can. For example, cached installers take up a lot of space. MSI files, MSP files, MST files. Now, my old practice with 4.6 was just deleting the entire installer folder. That won't fly with that v5. I found that if I delete the installer folder and there's other cached folders within there that might contain an icon file or some fonts, the appx manifest XML file within the package may have pointers. A good example is to font, because the fonts leverage the virtual extension or the font subsystem. So in my case, the way I learned was I deleted the entire installer folder. Then when I went to launch my application on the client, it failed. And I went to the advanced debugging logs within Event Viewer, and I found that there was an error related to trying to add fonts. When I saw that, I opened up my appv file, went into the XML file, and I did find that it was pointing to fonts files within the installer folder, which I deleted. So I had to resequence and just keep those in there. So I know Dan Goff, who's pretty much, he has been kind of the authority on appv5 to this point. He really got ahead of the game and blogs probably the most useful information about it. He also confirmed and suggested, only delete the installer files themselves. Don't go deleting the entire installer folder. Connection groups and dummy PVAD are actually kind of interlinked here. PVAD is the primary virtual application directory. Anybody who's sequenced will know this because Microsoft actually did a good job of standardizing the sequencer. I know Dennis had said that 4.6 was complex compared to 5. And one of the things was the sequencer was a little more complex. There was a lot more input fields. You had to pick your streaming protocol. You had to point to your path. Now sequencing, really you just put in the name and the PVAD. So Microsoft's best practice on this is actually like pointing to the install directory of the application. It's possibly not a good idea. I think they've admitted to this point, and I saw it in Nikki Callan's presentation. If you use the PVAD for applications which you then put in a connection group, there could be conflicts. It just seems the way connection groups are processed by the client that the primary virtual directories conflict with one another. They kind of like overlap or something like that. I haven't seen it personally myself. Initially I was actually setting the PVAD and hadn't seen any issues, but I'm going to err on the side of safety since Microsoft seems to suggest it too. Dummy PVAD. Now the question is, do you use a dummy PVAD for every application? Because how are you going to know which applications will end up in connection groups? There might be a demand further down the line. Personally, I'm okay with that, using the dummy PVAD. I think Microsoft has suggested in their sequencing guide that the reason why it's a best practice to point to the install directory is for performance. But from what I've seen, it's minimal at best. It's like milliseconds in the difference in some applications. It's kind of similar to the old AppV46 NNT versus VFS debate, where Microsoft's best practice was sequence directly to a directory in the Q drive, or whatever the virtual drive is. Don't just let the application install to its default location. Now, back years ago, I actually did some benchmark testing on that, and I found that it's like milliseconds in the difference. So we were going through a lot of problems sequencing the Q, application's not working, then have to resequence to the C, and in the end it wasn't really worth it for milliseconds of difference in performance. So personally, I'm going with the dummy PVAD for all my applications now. Reboots. So in AppV46, reboots were actually simulated by the sequencer. In AppV5, that's no longer the case. The sequencer will actually allow you to restart the machine, as in it will stop the machine and start it back up and then process whatever the application wanted to do on startup. Now again, I saw Nikki Callan had reported some issues with that, where the sequencer didn't kick back in quicker than the application processed the rest of its pending tasks. So it didn't pick up on some of that stuff. His suggestion was, if the application says, hey, would you like to reboot? Don't. Just manually reboot it yourself to give it some time. Even with 4.6, personally, I always try to figure out if the application was putting something in like the run once in the registry or whatever, and trying to figure out what that is to make sure it does get captured properly. Might be a little overkill. Maybe you only have to do that if the application doesn't work, but it's still a good idea. Finally, the most basic one here is the reports. Talked a little bit about it in terms of what it can provide versus AppDNA and ChangeBase and Flexera's tool. The majority, and I think Aaron will agree, the majority of issues reported on the TechNet forums can simply be resolved if they actually reviewed the reports and saw what was excluded. And people just, I don't know, is it a case that they sequence so many applications that they just tend to ignore that it exists? They just skip and click next and don't even think it matters. But it is definitely worth checking out the reports. I know you might have to scroll through a lot of like temp files that don't matter, but there might be one file in there that's in an application-specific directory that's going to matter.
I do get a couple of posts sometimes that actually post the report and say, well, what do you think the problem is? You would answer them, well, it's right there in the report. The problem is what the report's telling you the problem is.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't get the brightest sparks on the forum sometimes. Global publishing. So, I mean, it's obviously dependent on your environment. You may revert to user publishing. You may not have the ability to go with global publishing, or maybe you only global publish some of your applications. But there's some fringe benefits to using global publishing over user publishing. There's certain virtual extensions which are available in global publishing and not in user publishing. Run virtual, which is, I think it's a pretty huge feature. I have used it, I must admit, only like toying around. I haven't had a use case in a production environment using it yet. I could see how it may become troublesome to manage that over time if you have multiple applications which require to run virtual of the same app. It might get a little lost in the dark there. Shims and scripting are kind of a little bit tied together. Obviously, with the scripting, using the deployment config file, you can now run scripts in the system context with it, which is huge. It means if you do split out your drivers, for example, you can have those installed before the virtual application is put on the machine. You can also have it uninstall as well if there is an uninstall. But I also call the attention to shims. Something that I found pretty useful is the fact that we can now install things. That means we can also install shims with our virtual applications. And to me, that was a big headache in the past. Of course, you could use shims with FV46, and in some environments I had to. But the problem was then you are managing two packages seemingly again for one application, which is a pain in the ass. And also, the shim is very small, so just leave it on the machines. It's like an update, they'll never notice. But then you see them all stacked up. And, I don't know. Personally, I think this is a much better solution for shims. And, I mean, the fact AppV5 still isn't really an application compatibility fix for migrating applications, but this certainly helps. AppV and VDI, I wasn't at Synergy this week. I would imagine it's kind of been tossed about a little bit, perhaps. The shared content store, if anyone's used, I guess the equivalent in 4.6, which was the read-only cache, you'll know that this is a huge improvement. The read-only cache was kind of a pain in the ass to maintain, adding new applications whenever you had to, and also, Sean's not in the room, but as Sean was also telling me last night, and which I've seen before, if there's a network blip when you're updating that or it's being leveraged, it can completely crash, and you may have to reload the applications into the cache. Well, with shared content store, it's just a client configuration. You configure it on the client to use a shared content store. That way, it, streams the bits to your to a network share, and it doesn't commit anything to local disk. So it's a big win in terms of non-persistent desktops out there. Hotfix 4 is definitely a must because the publishing times do seem much better. Also, from a sequencing perspective, for getting around those write issues and also the applications running from the share. And even actually there's another, a bane of mine with AppV5 4 now, was the fact that when you start up a machine, that little PowerShell command that would be minimized down on the taskbar every time you log in. And if it was slow, which it was before Hotfix 4, you would see that every time, and it would just stay there and stay there. It's like, what is it doing? Well, that doesn't show up anymore if you have Hotfix 4. It just does what it does in the background, and the user won't need to know anything about it. User environment virtualization. Now I know Microsoft had their own optimization guidelines for AppV5, and their example is UEV, which I haven't heard too many companies actually using in production. You can use something like AppSense or Res for actually managing the application settings. of an AppV application, and performance should likely increase. I can't really speak definitively on that now, side by side with Hotfix 4 having rolled out, but I would assume that actually having the application settings managed by one of those tools should increase performance also. Biggest problem, and I heard Sean Bass actually he was in the crowd at the Geek Speak, and I know that he also talked about this briefly, but one of the big problems with AppV and VDI is not all applications are compatible. They still aren't at MP5, it's just the way it is. So what do you do with those applications that don't work? Well, if you've got a lot of resources and you have an environment that can cater for it, maybe you can silo the application and it's not a huge problem for you. If you're on limited resources, that becomes more of an issue. What do? Do you add it to your images? Well, if you're doing that and you come across applications in a few months, new applications, that also cannot be virtualized, what do you do with those? Hey, okay, finance is this application that can't be virtualized. They need it. Okay, we'll create a new finance image. A few months down the line, another department has an application which can't do, okay, we're going from like 4 images to 5 images because we need to cater for this one application that goes into their image. Or do you then maybe not do that and have a lot of applications that are irrelevant to some users, making the image bigger, and just it's all kind of a cluster. And unfortunately, there's still limitations with AppV5. It's not a huge mark against Microsoft because most of the competitors also have similar limitations, but it's certainly something to think about. You want to ensure that you have a contingency plan for those applications that cannot be virtualized. And actually, on this point, it wasn't part of my planned presentation, but I was talking to a fellow last night. I believe his last name is Sean Myberg. He's an attendee here. He was telling me that his company has 92% of their applications virtualized. That's far and away the highest number of applications virtualized that I've ever heard of in a production environment.
Did you say how many apps there were?
2.
No, I don't think it was in the thousands. Actually, it was in the thousands, wasn't it? I think he said originally they had 6,000 and they rationalized down to maybe like 1,000.
That's awesome.
I'm not sure of that, but his management, or the management there, took a very hardline approach when it came to AppV. They really backed the solution. If an application did not work in AppV, they looked for a competitor's product that would.
Wow.
Yeah, they factored in AppV as part of their rationalization.
In the UK, one attendee of one of the Citrix user groups, Citrix UK user groups, had 100% application virtualization.
Wow.
He had about he had a couple of hundred apps, but their management team had taken the same tack. No application gets bought if it doesn't work with AppV.
That's awesome.
And they went through their entire application estate, and if there was any sign of that application not working, they got rid of the application. They were incredibly hardline about it.
That was amazing.
Technically, that's 99% because he's not virtualizing the AppV client itself.
I will find him and break the news. Take the wind out of his sails. All right.
Finally, I just mentioned the scheduler, and I've only been playing with it for about a week, so I can't speak about it too definitively, but it's really cool. It's really worth a look, particularly if you're in a virtual environment. It really takes a lot of the guesswork and having to do some of the PowerShell scripting. It can cleanly flush out the application cache for you. It's very easy to configure. You just point it to your AppV application share, and it will pull down whatever applications you add to it as you add them to it. It can also even process pending tasks. So you can set it, if there's a pending task that doesn't get finished, you can set, okay, every 30 seconds, try to finish that. Try to invoke it again. Definitely worth a look, and there is a free community version. If you just go to Bram Wolf's adv.com, and I've got it on my final slide, so that you'll see that one before the end. AbbVie versus the competition, and I won't go too deep into this because I know Dennis did a much more comprehensive version of this. Well, I've used some of them very briefly, but I've used all of these technologies. And actually the one that I used very briefly was New Message Application Jukebox. So I would actually echo what Dennis was saying this morning. AbbVie, like Dennis said as well, it's got the most documentation out there. It's probably got the best support. If there is an issue, generally you will find the answer online. Even with AbbVie 5, I think people have ramped up pretty well to it now. Also, I will actually go out on a limb and I will say that before now, if a company was on AbbVie 4.6 and they were talking about going to 5, I would kind of ease away from it because I wasn't very confident in AbbVie 5, even as SP2, as a product to suggest to a customer. However, with Hotfix 4, I think it's finally ready. They finally got there.
Would you have called it a hotfix?
I wouldn't have personally.
Yeah.
There were such major changes.
Yep.
Yeah,
Should have been a version.
kind of hiding it a little.
Service back. Personally, I think it should have been SP3.
SP3, yeah, I agree.
Oh, come on, it's only 200 megabytes in size. Yeah, thanks. They're all-
All right, real quick, VMware ThinApp. Personally, I'm a little disappointed by ThinApp. I was really impressed when I initially saw it. I tried out some applications that didn't work in AbbVie 4.6 at the time with ThinApp, and they seemed to work, so it seemed to have better compatibility. Now, in terms of compatibility, it seems to have kind of slid behind AbbVie 5 SP2. They also just haven't really put much effort into developing it as a solution. They seem to kind of buck the audience a little bit there for a while when they were deciding to scrap it as a standalone product to buy. Now they kind of backtracked on that, and you can still buy it separately, but they were planning, I guess, on selling it only with other products in their suite, like Horizon. And they do seem to have developed it to integrate very well in a Horizon environment, but that's very VMware-centric, so not everybody's going to be there. Semantic workspace virtualization, I have to admit I haven't tried the newer version. I think 6.5 was the last version I tried. There's some very nice things in there. Dennis had already talked about it, how it runs in the kernel there, so there's better application compatibility. Yep.
Interestingly, I've seen benchmarks that it is way faster than AbbVie.
Semantic?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and even the ThinApp is faster than AbbVie. My experience does not reflect what the benchmark showed.
Oh, really? For which one? For ThinApp?
Especially for ThinApp, because it's slow as hell. Especially with larger applications.
Good show, man. See you, Rich. See you next time.
So it's perfect for smaller applications, because
Yeah.
it's compact standalone executable.
Yeah.
But for larger applications, it gets slow. I don't have experience with semantic, but
To quote Dennis, his number one use case for ThinApp was delivery of the Citrix receiver.
And actually on the ThinApp thing, you're talking about large applications. Now, not in the latest version, but in the version that stuck around for years because they didn't develop a newer release until recently. I had virtualized a lot of large applications and then linked them together. And I think it was a sizing issue, but basically because there were such large applications, it was so slow at loading the large applications. When they were linked together, it wasn't there in time to see the dependencies, and it was just a nightmare to troubleshoot. And in the end, we had to create just one huge package, which also wasn't very good.
you can trick it a little by making it load large chunks at once, but
Yeah, it's not good. Spoon.net. I really like Spoon.net. They're very granular in what they let you control in your virtual applications. I think they've got a pretty clever model too, from what I'm seeing. they've developed this sandbox. I don't know if any of you have seen it, sandbox for web developers, where basically you can pick almost any version of an existing browser, like Opera, Firefox, Chrome, IE, whatever's out there. Next screen, pick what add-ins you want, like things like ad blocker, or even something as obscure as YouTube to MP3 converters in there. And pick your plugins, Java, maybe Adobe Reader, Flash Player. Hit next, and it just builds the browser in a sandbox, virtualized with Spoon, and it's up there. Now that's a very niche market, I guess, but if they do that with other applications where they basically, I guess, can get it to a point where maybe, say, you can build Office for your users, and all you have to do is inject in maybe your a license key or set it up to use your KMS server, then that would be a pretty good solution. It would actually be better than, I know Microsoft have improved it, with the AppV solution for sequencing Office 2013, where you like download the application. If they could do that through their current GUI wizard, I think it would be pretty cool. And if they could do it for even more applications, right on.
Do any of these work on Mac?
No. Actually, you messing Mike.
I think we messed in this.
It does.
I think so.
Yeah, I think that might. Yeah, and you mess, I can't really talk too much about it. I think cloud paging is pretty cool. Cameo, both Cameo and Spoon actually seem to be trying to take on VMware ThinApp at this time. They try to be trying to corner that market. Cameo is kind of similar in how it works. Spoon, their studio tool actually provides a converting tool to convert your existing ThinApp packages to the Spoon format. So they're coming after them, and they probably should be scared because I think Spoon's pretty cool. But in the end, AppV has the widest user base. It's probably got the most information out there, the most support, and most people have the SA that are using, or most big enterprises have an SA, so it's pretty available to them.
So what about cloud volumes?
Cloud volumes I haven't included because I don't have any experience with it. I saw it in Dennis's one. To me, and Dennis, you might be able to speak to it, but to me it sounded a bit like the way Unidesk handles their applications, how it's captured onto VMDK or VHD.
They basically do the same installation, but the...
Okay.
We can continue outside, okay?
Yep. All right. Questions? I've kind of answered a few. If there's no questions, you can check out my site. If you want to email me any questions I can't get to, check out the Application Virtualization Smackdown 2014 for a side-by-side comparison. And also check out Brown Wolf's website for the scheduler. And that's it.